Chapter 8. Isabella's boots pounded against concrete as she sprinted through the maze-like corridors of the abandoned warehouse. The envelope was still in her jacket pocket, her gun drawn in her right hand. Behind her, something moved through the darkness, something fast. Too fast to be human. The sound of pursuit wasn't the familiar rhythm of running footsteps, but something else. A fluid four-legged gait that covered ground with terrible efficiency. The occasional scrape of claws against concrete sent ice through her veins. She skidded around a corner, pressing her back against a graffiti-covered wall, trying to control her breathing. The rough brick bit into her shoulder blades through her blouse, cold and unyielding, bleeding. Her lungs burned with the effort of silent inhalations through her nose, a technique she'd learned during tactical training from her time working with the drug enforcement. Sweat trickled down her spine, despite the cool night air soaking the back of her blouse and making it cling uncomfortably to her skin. The smell of old machinery oil and damp concrete filled her nostrils, underlaid with something musky and animal that didn't belong in this urban setting. Think, Isabella. Think! The voice in her head took on the measured tones of her law school mentor, who'd taught her that panic was the luxury of those without responsibility. The rational part of her brain was cataloguing explanations. A homeless person with a flashlight, a drug addict with reflective eyes, even a large dog or coyote. Atlanta had an urban wild, so it had to be explainable. But the deeper, more primal part of her brain, connected to ancestors who had survived by recognizing predators in the wild, wasn't buying any of it. The growl that echoed through the warehouse was none of those things. The sound reverberated off the concrete walls, making it impossible to pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from everywhere, filling the space with menace. Its vibration felt physical, like a pressure wave that touched her skin. "What the hell?" she whispered through clenched teeth, the words barely audible. Her mouth was dry, her tongue sticking to the roof of her mouth, and her fear tasted metallic and sharp. Isabella tried to steady her breathing, listening for movement. Her heart pounded against her ribs with such force she wondered if it could be heard. The warehouse had become a three-dimensional maze. Catwalks above, smaller rooms to the sides. Machinery creating obstacles and hiding places. The broken skylights allowed shafts of moonlight to pierce the darkness, creating islands of visibility in a sea of shadow. She needed to reach her car. But her mental map of the complex had become disoriented in the darkness. Pulling out her phone would create light that would give away her position. Isabella flexed her fingers around the grip of her weapon, the familiar texture grounding her in reality. The gun felt almost too small against whatever was hunting her, the weight of it no longer reassuring. A crash sounded from her, metal hitting concrete, as if something had knocked over a pile of debris. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far enough either. The echo died slowly, leaving a silence that felt even more threatening than the noise. Whatever was hunting her was moving systematically through the space, not randomly. It was like it knew what it was doing, like it had done this before. Isabella decided to move, staying low and using the abandoned machinery for cover. She couldn't stay still. Sitting targets didn't survive. She needed to find an exit, any exit, that would lead her back to the perimeter fence. Her legs tensed with controlled energy, ready to spring into motion at the first sign of immediate threat. The muscles in her thighs burned slightly from the unusual strain. A reminder that legal skills didn't necessarily translate to survival ones. Get a grip, she told herself. You faced down armed drug dealers in court. You can handle this. But armed drug dealers didn't have eyes that glowed red in the darkness. They didn't move with the silent, predatory grace of whatever was stalking her now. They didn't make her primitive brain scream danger with every cell in her body. Moonlight briefly illuminated a nearby wall as she edged around a rusted conveyor wall. The brick was covered in layers of graffiti, tags, murals, messages, creating a palimpsest of urban expression. A spray-painted arrow marked exit, with an arrow pointing left, likely left by urban explorers for their navigation. Isabella followed it, moving as quietly as possible, her footfalls deliberately placed to avoid debris. The floor was littered with broken glass that crunched treacherously underfoot, and puddles of unknown liquid reflected moonlight like black mirrors. The corridor narrowed, darkness deepening where the moonlight couldn't reach. The air was growing damper with the smell of mold and standing water. Isabella had to slow her pace, feeling her way forward with one hand against the wall. The rough brick caught at her fingertips, decades of grime embedding under her manicured nails. Her foot connected with something metallic, sending it skittering across the floor with a betraying clang that seemed to echo endlessly in the confined space. The sound was like a gunshot in the silence, metal scraping against concrete in a jarring cacophony before finally coming to rest. Then silence fell again, absolute and oppressive. Isabella held her breath, every muscle tense as she waited, her body still as stone. She could feel her pulse in her throat, hear the blood rushing in her ears. 5 seconds, 10, 15. Then came the sound of running. Not human footsteps, but the rhythmic padding of something on 4 legs, moving with frightening speed toward her location. The sound was unmistakable. Claws clicked against concrete, creating a counterpoint to the soft pads. Tick, 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 thud. Tick, 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 thud, growing louder with terrifying rapidity. Oh God, it really is some kind of animal. Isabella's mind flashed to news reports of exotic pets released in Georgia, panthers, wolves, even tigers occasionally found in suburban neighborhoods. Isabella abandoned stealth and ran, charging blindly down the corridor. The darkness gave way to dim light as she emerged into a larger space, some kind of former loading dock, with massive doors partly open to the night. The air changed, fresher, carrying the scent of honeysuckle and wet earth from outside. The sudden transition from confined corridor to open space momentarily disoriented her. But she recovered quickly, eyes fixed on her goal. She sprinted for the gap, the cold night air visible just yards away. Freedom, safety, rationality. Her muscles burned with the effort, adrenaline pushing her beyond her usual limits. The abandoned loading dock was littered with obstacles. Broken pallets, rusted machinery parts, fallen ceiling tiles soggy with rainwater. She navigated them at full speed, the distance to freedom narrowing with each stride. A shadow detached itself from the ceiling, dropping to the floor between Isabella and the exit. It landed with impossible grace. A crouching figure that rose slowly to its full height, unfolding with fluid motion that no gymnast could replicate. The sound of its landing was barely a whisper, a predator's silent approach. Isabella skidded to a stop, her boots sliding slightly on the gritty concrete, weapon raised instantaneously, muscle memory overriding shock. Her finger moved to the trigger, applying just enough pressure to take up the slack. Sweat trickled down her temple. salt stinging the corner of her eye. She could make out a human silhouette in the dim moonlight. But the movements were wrong, too fluid, too predatory. The figure's head tilted, studying almost curiously, like a scientist observing an interesting specimen. The silence stretched between them, broken only by Isabella's ragged breathing. "Don't come any closer," Isabella warned, aiming directly at the center mass. Her voice projected the authority she'd cultivated in courtrooms, betraying none of the fear coursing through her veins. The words seemed to hang in the damp air, vibrating with tension. Atlanta PD. A lie. She was a prosecutor, not a cop. But the figure wouldn't know the difference. Sometimes perception creates its own reality. The silhouette stepped forward, entering a shaft of moonlight that spilled through a broken skylight overhead. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man, dressed in dark clothes that seemed to absorb what little light reached him. His features were obscured by shadow, but his posture radiated danger. He moved with liquid grace, each step deliberately placed as if he had all the time in the world. The only sound was the whisper of expensive fabric as he moved, and the barely audible crunch of grit beneath what appeared to be handcrafted leather shoes. "I said stop!" Isabella's voice echoed in the cavernous space, bouncing back at her from metal and concrete. The acoustics created a chorus of her command, momentarily disorienting in its intensity. The man took another step, then another. His confidence was absolute, as if her weapon was of no consequence, as if she were of no consequence. The moonlight caught his profile. His face was longer and more angular than Mikhail's familiar Slavic features, with ruddy cheekbones and a nose that had been broken at least once. His auburn hair was curly, shoulder length. "Final warning!" Her voice remained steady, even as her mind calculated the odds of survival. The exit was blocked. The man was between her and freedom. She'd have to shoot her way past him. The implications of having to shoot him flickered through her mind. Legal consequences, professional fallout, headlines. None of it mattered if she didn't survive the night. He continued his advance, casual and unhurried. With each graceful step, the space between them narrowed, shrinking to 15 feet, then 12, then 10. Isabella fired dead center into his chest. The shot exploded through the warehouse, deafeningly loud in the confined space, causing her ears to ring loudly. The muzzle flash temporarily blinded her, leaving purple after images dancing across her vision. The acrid scent of gunpowder filled her nostrils, sharp and chemical. She saw the man stagger back a half step, hit. But then he straightened, seemingly unfazed, and continued his advance as if the bullet had been no more than a minor annoyance. Impossible. She knew she'd hit him center mass. She was a good shot, practiced weekly at the range, and maintained her certification with scores well above required minimums. Center mass was center mass. People didn't just shrug off bullet wounds. "Stay back!" Her voice cracked slightly, betraying the first hint of genuine fear. She took a step backward, maintaining distance, buying seconds to process what she'd just witnessed. The rubber heel of her boot caught on a piece of debris, nearly throwing her off balance before she recovered. The figure continued forward, now close enough that she could see his face, partly illuminated by moonlight. Ruddy, chiseled features that might have been attractive in another context, now rendered predatory by the hunger in his expression. Strong cheekbones, muscular jaw, skin pale as marble in the silver light. He smiled, revealing teeth that seemed too white, too sharp in the darkness. The smile never reached his eyes, which remained fixed on her with the focus of a predator. Isabella fired again and again. 3 rounds, all finding their mark in rapid succession. The impacts were visible, his body jerking slightly with each hit, but he simply glanced down at his chest, where the bullets should have torn through flesh, as if checking for lint on his shirt. His dark clothing showed no signs of damage, no spreading stain of blood, nothing to indicate he'd been shot 4 times at close range. When he raised his head, his eyes caught the moonlight, reflective amber, not human, but like a cat's eyes in headlights. But no cat walked upright on 2 legs, no cat wore the shape of a man. The eyes seemed to glow from within, an effect Isabella tried desperately to attribute to light reflection rather than impossible reality. Dios, Isabella whispered, the prayer of a woman who hadn't attended church since her mother's funeral. The words fell from her lips without conscious thought, an instinctive appeal to higher powers when rational explanation failed. Your God can't help you here. His voice was cultured, almost pleasant, with the faintest trace of what sounded like a Gaelic accent. The kind of voice that would be charming over dinner, now rendered terrifying by context. It carried effortlessly across the space between them, resonating with a depth that seemed to vibrate in her chest. No one can! Isabella fired her final round, aiming for his head this time. At this range, it was an easy shot. The bang was just as loud as before, but it now carried the finality of her last bullet. The bullet grazed his temple, tearing a furrow along his scalp. He touched the wound, looking at the blood on his fingers with mild surprise, as if he'd forgotten he could bleed. The dark liquid gleamed black in the moonlight, viscous and shining against his pale skin. Impressive aim, he said, examining the blood on his fingertips with academic interest. But ultimately futile. Isabella turned and ran in the opposite direction, deeper into the warehouse. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was wrong, running away from the exit. But instinct drove her to put distance between herself and the impossible man whom bullets couldn't harm. Her mind raced ahead, mapping possible routes. There had to be another exit. The place was enormous, with multiple entry points. She just needed to find one and circle back to her car. Her empty weapon was still clutched in her hand, useless against whatever this man was, but potentially useful as a bluff against anyone else she might encounter. The corridors became a blur as Isabella pushed her body to its limits, the envelope still held within her jacket. Her lungs burned with exertion, each breath tearing at her throat. The air grew thicker as she moved deeper into the complex, heavy with dust and decades of accumulated grime. Behind her, she could hear her pursuer moving unhurriedly, as if sure of the outcome. The sound was almost casual, which terrified her more than a full pursuit would have. Like a cat toying with a mouse, already certain of its meal. He was toying with her. You can't outrun me, Miss Santos, his voice called from the darkness. The acoustics of the warehouse making it impossible to pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, smooth and amused, echoing off concrete and metal. Though I must say, your attempt is admirable. How did he know her name? Isabella rounded a corner and found herself in what must have been an administrative section. Smaller rooms, with doorways, a different architectural style than the industrial spaces. The floors here were covered in cracked linoleum tiles, rather than bare concrete, the sound of her footsteps changing as she ran. Offices, perhaps, or storage for valuable equipment. She ducked into one, easing the door closed behind her with barely a whisper of sound. The hinges protested with the faintest squeak, making her wince. The room had once been an office. Moonlight filtered through a dirty window, illuminating a space long since stripped of anything valuable. The glass was cloudy with decades of grime, turning the moonlight into a diffuse glow that barely penetrated the darkness. Empty filing cabinets stood against one wall, with drawers hanging open like gaping mouths. A desk remained bolted to the floor, its surface covered in dust and bird droppings. The air was stale, undisturbed for years until her entrance, and carried the musty scent of long-abandoned spaces. Paper slowly returning to pulp, metal oxidizing, the droppings of small creatures who had claimed the space. Isabella moved to the window, but it was barred from the outside. There was no escape. The metal bars were thick with rust, flaking under her touch, leaving orange residue on her fingertips. The only exit was the way she'd come in. She pressed her back against the wall beside the door, listening intently for sounds of pursuit. She still had 3 rounds in her gun, but she swapped magazines anyway. Not that bullets seemed to do any good. Isabella felt a surge of frustration and panic. She needed a backup plan. Isabella pressed herself against the wall beside the door, breathing heavily. She could hear footsteps now, deliberate, unhurried, approaching down the corridor. Each step was evenly spaced, a metronome of approaching danger. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of expensive leather soles on the linoleum floor was confident and unrushed. From beyond the door came a low, amused chuckle. The sound a diner might make upon discovering an especially delightful dessert on the menu. The laugh seemed to seep under the door, filling the small office with threat. "I can hear your heartbeat, miss." "Santos," the voice called, smooth and amused. "It's racing quite beautifully." Isabella remained silent, trying to control her breathing and slow the hammering of her heart, which served as a homing beacon. Her hand gripped the gun, knowing it was useless but unwilling to surrender the psychological comfort it provided. Her palms were slick with sweat, but her mind remained analytical, cataloguing options. "The envelope you're carrying won't help you." The voice continued, closer now, conversational, as if they were discussing files over coffee rather than engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse. The acoustics of the hallway carried his voice clearly, as if he was speaking directly into her ear. Nathan was always prone to embellishment, and in his current state, I'm afraid his grip on reality is rather tenuous. The door handle turned slowly, metal scraping against metal with deliberate precision. The sound was excruciating in its slowness, the mechanism's inner workings protesting after years of disuse. Isabella raised her weapon anyway, aiming at head height. Perhaps a point-blank shot to his head would do the trick. Maybe. The door swung open, hinges crying out after years of neglect, the sound sharp and startling in the tense silence, but no one entered. The doorway remained empty, revealing only the darkened hallway beyond. A psychological tactic, trying to draw her out, make her check the corridor. She recognized the technique from hostage negotiation training, remaining still and fingering the trigger. Her breath caught in her throat, waiting. I have no interest in harming a city prosecutor. The voice came again, now from further away, as if he'd moved down the corridor. Each word was precisely enunciated, cultured, and almost soothing in its cadence. It creates so much tedious paperwork. I merely want what's Aldrich's. Isabella weighed her options. The window was barred. The only exit was through the door, into the corridor where he waited. She could try to wait him out, but that seemed unlikely to succeed, given his apparent patience and her need for eventual escape. Making a split-second decision, Isabella bolted through the open doorway, sprinting down the corridor opposite the voice. The floor was slick beneath her boots. She turned a corner, then another, moving as fast as she dared in the dim light. Her boots, surprisingly silent on the gritty linoleum. Years of running for stress management now paid dividends in speed and endurance. Her muscles responded smoothly to the demands she placed on them, though a burning had begun in her lungs from sustained exertion. "Resourceful?" the voice called, sounding impressed rather than frustrated. His words echoed through the corridors, seeming to come from all directions simultaneously. "I can see why you've been so effective in the courtroom." The corridor ended at a metal door marked with a faded exit sign, the red letters barely visible beneath years of grime. Isabella slammed against it, pushing the release bar with more force than necessary, the metal cool beneath her palms. The mechanism resisted, stuck from years of disuse, then gave way with a protesting shriek of metal against metal. The door opened to the night air, the sudden rush of fresh oxygen, almost dizzying after the musty confines of the warehouse. The scent of rain-washed concrete and nearby trees filled her lungs, startlingly clean after the stale interior. A drizzle had begun, droplets cool against her overheated skin. For one brief moment, relief flooded through her, muscles relaxing infinitesimally. Then she realized where she was. A narrow alley between buildings, not the main yard. She'd have to navigate back around to reach her car. But it was an exit. A chance. Isabella pushed forward, the envelope's contents suddenly seeming worth the danger. The alley was littered with debris, broken pallets, rusted metal, shattered glass that crunched beneath her boots. The rain had made it slick, reflecting the scant moonlight in broken patterns. She picked her way through as quickly as possible, heading toward what she hoped was the front of the complex. The alley turned sharply, and Isabella found herself facing a dead end. A brick wall rose 15 feet high, topped with rusted barbed wire that gleamed dully in the moonlight. There was no way over it, no way through it. Her gaze darted around the enclosed space, searching for ladders, handholds, dumpsters to climb. Anything that might provide escape. Nothing but rain-slick brick and concrete, offering no purchase for escape. She was trapped. Shit, shit, shit. Isabella turned to retrace her steps, her usual eloquence abandoned in extremity. The curse words felt foreign on her tongue. She rarely swore, priding herself on verbal precision, but they were all her mind could produce in this moment of pure panic. A massive black wolf with silver-tipped fur stood in the alley's entrance, blocking her only escape route. Isabella raised her weapon automatically, though her mind struggled to process what she saw. The animal was enormous. Too large to be a normal wolf, its proportions all wrong. Its shoulders stood nearly 4 feet high, its body powerfully muscled beneath a coat of midnight black fur. Along its back and the ruff around its neck, The fur was tipped with silver that seemed to catch the moonlight, creating an ethereal halo effect. Steam rose from its body in the cool air, each exhalation creating a small cloud around its muzzle. But it was the ice that held her frozen. Intelligent, aware, glowing with an internal reddish-amber light as they fixed on her with unmistakable purpose. They were not animal eyes. They were something else, something impossible. They contained a consciousness, assessment, and decision-making beyond animal instinct. "This isn't real," she whispered, the words a talisman against madness. "This can't be real."